Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's CIPD Coronavirus webinar on fairness in reward and recognition post-COVID-19. My name is Daphne Judy Green, and I'm the head of CIPD Northern England, and it's great to be chairing this discussion for you today. So the CIPD Coronavirus webinar series is one of the ways that CIPD has been helping people professionals to navigate all the business change created by the pandemic. And in today's session, we will be exploring what employers need to consider as they plan ahead with their reward strategies and practices to ensure fairness post-pandemic. So we've got two experts on our call today who will share insights and advice, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Our first speaker is Charles Cotton, Senior Policy Advisor, Performance and Reward at CIPD. And we've got Xiaowei, who is the Senior Research Economist from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So it's great to have you both with us today. So before we get started and talk about the session, I just need to go through some housekeeping with you. The session will be recorded and will be available on demand in our webinar section on the CIPD website. You can also access all the previous webinars and also sign up for future ones as well. You will be muted throughout the session, but we would encourage questions for our panel, so please use the Q&A box. We will be monitoring the chat box, but we would prefer that you use the chat box really to share your observations and insight, but any question for the panel, please pop them into the Q&A box. So just to go through some additional resources that CIPD have been offering throughout the pandemic. If you haven't gone onto the CIPD Coronavirus Hub, I would recommend it. It's got all the latest guidance and resources for CIPD members. And you can also get access to an individual legal advice line called our HR Inform line, and that's available 24/7. And then finally, all members across the UK and Ireland have access to a wellbeing provider. We've been working with Health Assured, and we're now providing free help and support 24/7, 365 days a year via the telephone or online consultations with qualified therapists. So you can find out all about those resources via the CIPD member benefits page. Okay, just to set some context for today, so throughout the pandemic, many people's finances have been hit hard, with job losses and others seeing their incomes fall. And unfortunately, women, low-paid workers and ethnic minorities have been disproportionately affected. And during this time, job roles that were once previously taken for granted or branded low-skilled are now being seen as essential. So what does this mean for the profession? And can we expect you now to really look at your reward practices and look and really check in on whether they are fair? So latest research from CIPD shows that 3 in 10 employers had only thought about fairness post the pandemic. So really today's webinar aims to help you to think through some of those initial steps that you can take to tackle some of the unequal impact caused by the pandemic and learn more about what fairer reward practices look like. So the running order is Charles will kick off and he'll talk about the CIPD perspective and share some of the research. And then we'll move on to Xiaowei, who will also share lots of insight. Then back to Charles around some of the practical things that HR can do. And then we will open up for questions. So that's it for me. I'm going to hand over to Charles to get us kicked off. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Daphne, and welcome everybody. So what am I going to cover? So this, my next slide shows that I'm going to touch on reward fairness, both pre and during the pandemic. What do we mean by reward fairness? Why it's important, before handing over to Xiaowei, and then once she's given her presentation, she'll hand back and I'll be talking about how can reward and people professionals help. So my next slide, I think it just kind of reiterates the point that this isn't anything new. In the past, to deal with concerns about fairness of how organizations treated such groups as employees or customers, investors, communities, etc., the UK has usually introduced various regulations, and in terms of the workplace, employers have been required by law to treat their employees fairly in terms of people management practices and policies. including how they reward them. So for instance, back in 1975, we had legislation which required employers to pay the same or similar amounts to those men and women doing the same or similar jobs. And more recently, to indicate whether people are being treated fairly, large UK employers have been required to disclose pay information, such as by gender, or the difference between what the CEO gets paid compared to what the rest of the firm earns. And prior to the pandemic, there was even talk about this requirement being extended to cover ethnicity. Now, the next slide looks at what's happened during the pandemic. And I think it would be fair to say that the pandemic, subsequent economic lockdowns, and acceleration of Black Lives Matter protests have all increased attention on fairness, including that in the workplace. In terms of reward, questions have been raised concerning the amounts on offer to key and essential workers in terms of their pay, their progression opportunities, and the benefits package, such as occupational sick pay or pension plans. The 2001 CIPD Reward Management Survey found that in response to the pandemic, 30% of all employers had thoughts about the fairness of their reward practices, while 25% had then gone on to act or had plans to do so by March 2021. Examples of actions included conducting an equal pay audit, carrying out a gender pay gap review, making the appraisal process clearer, reviewing the performance-related pay scheme. In addition, we found that 22% of employers had, in response to Black Lives Matter, thought about the fairness of their reward decisions, while 19% had taken action or had plans to do so. And these included ethnicity pay gap reporting, introducing new pay policies, benchmarking jobs, and reviewing the current spend on benefits to ensure fairness across all employees. We also asked respondents whose employers hadn't taken action in response to Black Lives Matter what had prevented them from doing so. The most common response was that over half of senior managers had already reviewed procedures and outcomes and judged them to be fair. Of course, this raises concerns about how did senior management carry out this review? How did they seek employee views? Were the findings from this review shared with employees and line managers? And of course, this is important, as even if reward is fair, some might not believe it is unless they've been shown the evidence. Other common explanations for not taking action was that there were no internal pressures from employees, or senior management didn't see the matter as a priority. Now, the next slide looks at some other findings from our research, which shows reward fairness during the pandemic. And we also found that 2/5 of employers believe that most or all employees in the organization thought that they were being paid fairly, and that overall this hadn't changed much in light of recent events. However, a significant proportion of employers admitted that they didn't know this. They didn't know what their employees thought about the fairness of reward in their organizations, or how employee perceptions of reward fairness had changed, mainly because they didn't ask. So, we've talked about the pandemic and the impact. So what do we mean by fairness? So this slide looks at the issues. I mean, it's very complex. For example, when looking at fairness, is it in terms of pay? Is it the amount of money that's fair, or the amount of pay in relation to the skill required or the effort needed to do the job, or how it compares to what other people are getting, such as those doing the same or similar work for the organization or in other organizations, or how it compares to the cost of living or other jobs in the same region, or is it a combination of some or more of these factors? So people and reward professionals need to be aware that, of these various factors, and that there are multiple perspectives on fairness at work. In reward terms, and from an organization's perspective, we can identify 3 types. One is the reward, the fairness of the reward outcomes, known as distributive justice, which is around how the reward budget is distributed. There's also the fairness of the process used in making reward decisions, known as procedural justice, and the quality of the treatment people received when procedures are being implemented, which is known as interactual justice. These forms of organizational justice can create trust because they signal that people are respected and valued by the organization. By contrast, if people think an employer's reward approach isn't fair, they might not want to join or stay, or may lack motivation. Now, I've talked about the various definitions and perspectives on fairness, and there is a CIPD report on that, known as the Changing Contours of Fairness, and that will be at the end of my presentation. I'll have a link of all the sources that I've cited in my presentation. So the next slide looks at why we think that reward fairness is important. So, I mean, I've touched on the moral issues and the legal issues around fairness, and there are business considerations as well. For instance, will potential investors or customers want to invest or spend money with a firm that does not reward its people fairly? Similarly, will employees want to join and stay with such a firm? Now, CIPD research found that being rewarded fairly is an important aspect of employee financial well-being, and poor financial well-being results in poor employee performance and ultimately in poor employer performance. Similarly, CIPD research shows that fair reward is an important aspect of job quality, though the most recent CIPD survey of UK working lives found that less than half of workers think that their pay is appropriate for what they do. Now, before I touch on what HR can do, I'm going to hand over to Xiaowei, who will be looking at what impact the pandemic and the economic lockdowns have had on people in the economy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. Yeah, so as Charles said, I'm going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on different types of inequalities. This is a much more macro picture, I suppose, than what Charles is going to cover later on. Should we get to the next slide? So I think COVID-19 has really highlighted a lot of the inequalities that exist within our current system, as well as exacerbated inequalities along certain lines. So in terms of highlighting existing inequalities, we know, of course, that certain households have been much better placed to weather the economic shock than others. Some households live in much nicer housing, which makes it easier to self-isolate and work from home. And the pandemic has also really shone a light on the state of the benefit system, which, after 10 years of cuts, was really in no state to deal with this level of economic shock, which is why the government has introduced things like the furlough scheme and the self-employment scheme essentially from scratch. But as well as highlighting existing inequalities, COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities along certain lines. So, for example, by gender, by income, age, and ethnicity. So that's the focus of this presentation. And going forward, it's likely that COVID-19 will also leave a longer-term legacy on inequality, for example, because of changes in technology and preferences that we've seen over the course of the pandemic persisting when the pandemic subsides. So I don't think I'm going to talk that much about this, but if we have time, I might touch on a couple of points and maybe we can raise it again in the discussion. Next slide. So just to start, it's worth noting that the labour market impact of the pandemic has been hugely unequal across groups. So this chart shows of people who were employed in February 2020 before the pandemic hit, what share were no longer working, furloughed, or have seen a substantial cut in their pay in January 2021. So this is a chart from the Resolution Foundation, which is more recent than stuff IFS has done. So if you look at the first bar, the all bar, we see that of everyone who was employed in February 2020, roughly 6% were no longer in work in January 2021, and another 6% or so were furloughed. But this impact varies hugely across different groups. So looking down the different bars, oh no. Okay, sorry, my Zoom seems to be acting up. I think I can see and hear you, so I can just carry on without the video, I suppose. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, so looking down the different bars, We see that the impact has been much larger among young people, and specifically those 18 and 24, although to some extent we also see large impacts among older people closer to retirement age. There's a steep earnings gradient, so those who are in lower pay prior to the pandemic have suffered the largest labour market impact. There's also some differences by contract type, and in particular, employees on atypical contracts, so things including 0 hours contracts and part-time contracts, have seen a larger labour market hit than other types of employees. So just on this dimension, we don't see many differences by gender, although later on in later slides, I'll talk about gender inequalities in other respects. And we also see that ethnic minorities have suffered a larger labour market shock than white people over the pandemic. Next slide, please. So why is this? Why have labour market impact varied so much across groups? Well, a lot of this can be explained by the public health response to the pandemic. So in particular, the shutting down or massive scaling back of entire sectors and widespread working from home. So just looking at the sectors people were in prior to the pandemic, it's not surprising that low paid people, for example, were more badly hit. So this chart shows, with data before the pandemic hit, what share of people across the earnings distribution worked in sectors that were not later shut down in the pandemic. So people who didn't work in things like retail, hospitality, and leisure sectors. And what we see here is that the highest earners were much more likely to work in sectors that weren't shut down over the pandemic. Next slide. So when you combine this with information on who can work from home, given widespread working from home over the pandemic, you see an even steeper gradient. So what the right-hand side panel shows is that of people in the highest tenth of the earnings distribution prior to the pandemic, more than 70% worked in sectors that were not shut down over the pandemic and worked in an occupation that could be done from home, compared to less than 20% of those in the bottom tenths of the earnings distribution. So it's not surprising, given the sectors people worked in and the jobs people did, that we see these massively unequal labour market impacts. Next slide, please. So of course, that's not the only way in which working from home has affected people. So the fact that people are working from home means that the type of housing you live in is now much more important to your day-to-day living standards than it was before the pandemic. And here we see huge inequalities by age and ethnicity as well. So what this chart shows is the amount of usable floor space per person across different age groups. And what we see here is that younger people and sort of early middle-aged people live in much smaller housing than older people. But I think what's interesting also is even within age groups, ethnic minorities tend to live in smaller housing than white people. So that's looking at the grey squares and circles on each of those bars. And those inequalities are particularly stark among older people. So as well as leading to differences in labour market impacts, widespread working from home, and the sort of need to work from home over the pandemic has exacerbated other inequalities in living standards. Next slide, please. So you recall in the first chart I showed that actually just looking at furloughs and layoffs, we don't see large differences by gender. However, if we hone down closer, looking at mothers and fathers in particular, we see that school closures have had a much larger impact on the careers of mothers than of fathers. So this is from an IFS survey that was run over the first lockdown, and it shows for mothers and fathers of different education levels, the share who remained in work, were furloughed, or were laid off or otherwise stopped working. And we see that for every educational level, mothers were more likely to have been furloughed or laid off than fathers were. We also see quite a steep education gradient, so those on low education levels were more likely to have been furloughed or laid off. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the reason for this is probably the impact of school closures, and we also see that as a result of school closures, mothers bore much more of the additional childcare responsibilities as a result. So this is from the same survey, and it shows the number of hours per day mothers and fathers spend providing childcare, doing housework, and doing paid work. So the first thing to note is that mothers and fathers who are not working spend more time providing childcare than mothers and fathers who are working, which is, I suppose, not surprising. And if you recall from the last slide, mothers are more likely to have given up work over the pandemic than fathers, and as a result, more likely to be providing more childcare. But I think what's also interesting is looking at the second half of this chart, so just focusing on mothers and fathers who remain in work. Mothers spend many more hours a day providing childcare than fathers do. So their careers are much more likely to have taken a hit as a result of school closures, even if they remain in work. So in this chart, I'm not breaking down paid work by whether or not you're only doing paid work or multitasking and doing other things on the side. But actually, if we were to break that down, you would see an even starker difference. So fathers, when they're doing the paid work, they tend to just be doing uninterrupted paid work, whereas mothers tend to be are much more likely to multitask and look after kids at the same time as they're primarily doing paid work. So there's really large gender differences on this respect. Next slide, please. So the last thing I wanted to highlight was the massive mental health impact the pandemic has had, which has in many ways exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. So this is a slightly complicated chart, so bear with me. But so the green bars show predicted levels of mental health during the first lockdown in the absence of the pandemic, where the measure of mental health we're using is the Generalized Health Questionnaire score, which is a general measure of mental health where a higher number indicates worse mental health. So a higher bar here indicates worse mental health. The predictions are a bit complicated. We use several years of individual level data pre-pandemic, along with demographic group-specific trends and seasonal trends and changes in individual circumstances to predict what your mental health is likely to have been in the absence of the pandemic. But even ignoring these complicated predictions, just the data pre-pandemic shows similar trends, right? So we see that in general, women have worse levels of mental health than men, and young people have worse mental health than older people. Now, the yellow bars show actual levels of mental health in April 2020, when the pandemic first hit. And what we see here is that groups that already had poor levels of mental health pre-pandemic suffered a larger mental health deterioration. So in particular, mental health deterioration was larger among women than men, and among young people than older people. It is worth noting that this is data from the first lockdown, and of course lots of things have changed since then. So when we updated some of this analysis using September 2020 data, we found that actually, even though younger people saw the largest initial hit, it was older people and older women in particular who saw the most persistent mental health impact. So they were the group who for whom mental health bounced back least by September 2020. I think that's quite interesting, thinking about the different factors that influence mental health, because I suppose lots of the things that would have affected mental health for younger people, so strong social restrictions during lockdown, the closures of universities and schools, and so on, were largely lifted by September, whereas sort of concerns around COVID and COVID itself still persisted over the summer, which affected older people more. So it'd be interesting to see how this picture has changed since then. Next slide, I think. Great. So I'll just say a couple of things to sum up. So as we've seen, the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities along a number of lines. It's also brought to the fore certain inequalities, for example, in housing, that weren't so important before the pandemic. And in terms of economic disparities, I think we might expect these to grow further as the furlough scheme is unwound. The longer run effect on inequality, I think, will largely depend on the extent to which changes in behaviours For example, preferences to work from home and online shopping, for example, persist beyond the span of the pandemic. And also the effects on inequality will depend hugely on policy choices. So for example, whether the uplift to universal credit is sustained, what the government does in terms of education and skills policy, and in particular retraining policy that's needed, and also if vacancies remain low, what the government does in terms of creating jobs or promoting investment to boost job growth. So I normally give this presentation to policymakers with a very policy angle in mind, but I try to think about, so what would be relevant for HR professionals? And I think there's a couple of points. So one is that there's quite a bit of evidence that lots of people plan to carry on working from home even after the pandemic ends, and employers are generally amenable to people working from home. I think that's great in a number of ways, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind that even prior to the pandemic, professionals had higher levels of job satisfaction and generally better mental health than people in non-professional roles. And of course, it's professionals who will be most able to benefit from future working from home. So I think it's important to think about how to structure practices to avoid further increasing this inequality along the lines of professionals that can start working from home and have that added flexibility versus, say, admin staff who have to keep coming into the office. I think onboarding new hires and training young people in general will be more difficult in a world in which people are working from home. So it's important to think about how to allow young people to develop their careers and carry on learning, including learning from watching other people in a world where lots of people are working from home. We know that at the moment there's still large numbers of employees who are furloughed, and in particular, I think interestingly, there's been a small percentage of employees who have been furloughed for the entire time since the pandemic began. So how to reintegrate them back into the workplace, I think, is a really interesting question. And finally, I think the pandemic has really brought to the fore inequalities in mental health and also exacerbated lots of inequalities in mental health. So it's important to think about how to support the mental health of employees going forward. Great, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Xiaowei. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to be talking about what HR can do to help their organization become fairer in terms of reward. I suppose the first thing to talk about is actually, if you're going to talk about fairness, you need a definition to help you talk about fairness. Our CIPD 2019 reward management survey, however, found that most employers didn't have a definition of what they constituted, what they considered to be fair. And even if a definition did exist, it wasn't necessarily widely shared. Yet having a definition in place is going to be essential if employees, investors and customers are going to be able to view whether the actions of an organization is fair. And so HR has an opportunity to help their organizations develop a shared understanding of what they mean by fair, and what can then, which then can be used by senior managers to help them judge their various reward choices and ensure consistency when these, when they are making reward decisions. So this definition can also be used to help explain reward actions to employees, investors, and other stakeholders, so they can understand the reward approach the firm is taking and why they're taking it. It will also show staff what they can expect from the employer and what the employer in return can expect from the employees. However, to be able to talk about reward fairness, employers need to review their existing approach to see if it's fair, and to take action to address legacy issues. This will depend not only on the employer having the information systems that capture the relevant data in the appropriate manner, but also on HR having the capabilities to analyze this information. So HR should be making the case to senior managers to have the money to be able to analyze this issue. It also depends on the employer having the funds to fix any issues that are identified. Though ignoring the problem could be very costly as well. So it's important that HR managers, professionals are able to highlight the costs of not only doing something, such as being fair, but also the benefits that could accrue to the organization of having fair rewards. So the next slide also touches on some other aspects. I mean, one is around having a livable wage and having decent benefits. So again, HR should make the case to senior managers for paying a livable wage and offering benefits that not only stretch the pay packet further, and here I suppose it would be things like discounts or financial support, but also offer protection such as against sickness. Now, paying a wage that people can live on can help organizations because money worries are, as I mentioned earlier, are a key driver of employee stress, which in turn impacts on productivity and organizational performance. So paying a living wage can boost your standing also among your customers and your investors. However, increasing wages can be challenging at the best of times, especially now. So people professionals can help organizations by reviewing the design of the employer, looking at how work and jobs are organized and how these can all be improved to boost productivity and sustain wage and benefit increases. For instance, upskilling employees so that the firm can focus on producing goods and services that have a higher profit margin. Being open and transparent about how these decisions were made, as I said earlier, procedural and transactional fairness, and the context that influence the decisions, such as the economic climate, can help explain this. There's a range, I suppose, from full transparency and openness, for example, where you may actually allow employees to set their own pay, to one where information is more restricted, for example, information about where you sit on your pay range. Now, HR needs to make an evaluation where their organization sits on this range and where the organization wants to move over time. And it may be that you start off giving limited information and over time you start to give more. Our reward management survey in 2019 found that line managers had an influential role when it came to proposing pay increases. Therefore, it makes sense that it's important that their recommendations are seen as fair. So you need to establish objective measures that align to organizational values, and the reward deal will be crucial, as is communicating this to employees. Now, line managers are also a key means of reward communication, so have a role in dealing with staff queries and passing on feedback. So HR has a role in championing investment in the people skills of existing and potential future line managers so that they're in a better position to make fair reward decisions and communicate the rationale behind this. Now, I suppose on its own, I'd say that reward fairness isn't enough. We can't just concentrate our efforts on pay and benefits. Employees would probably find it very odd if the organization was fair in terms of reward processes and outcomes. But when it came to deciding who does what, when, where, and how, there was less transparency and fairness. Therefore, HR should assist the organization in creating an overall fairness strategy, one that covers both how employees are treated as well as other stakeholders, such as customers. And I think now we've got some time for question and answers.
Thank you, Charles and Xiaowei. That was really insightful, a huge amount of information shared just then. And yes, plenty of questions coming in, all very varied actually. So I've been looking through and trying to group them, but I guess I'm going to kick off with the first question, which is around the BAME community. And we've got a couple of questions related to that community. I guess the first question is around why have they been consistently or more likely to be made redundant or hours shortened or furloughed and before and during the pandemic. So I guess you have any broader insight, and Xiaowei, I'm going to come to you first because you touched on some of this in your presentation.
Sure.
Do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that actually just reflects the jobs and the sectors ethnic minorities worked in prior to the pandemic. So we know that certain ethnicities, so for example, Pakistanis, are much more likely to work in service sectors, which were badly hit over the pandemic. I think there's probably a role for occupations as well within sectors. So even for a given sector, I think minorities are more likely to work in occupations that are not, that cannot be done from home. To be honest, I haven't looked into this in more detail, so I don't know whether the differences can be fully explained by differences in occupations and sectors, or whether there's another role as well.
Yeah. I guess related to that, there's an observation made by somebody on the call around, certain sectors haven't had to close down. They've remained open. They've been, people have been able to work from home. So I guess it's why haven't these sectors been hiring more, retaining more, and promoting and bringing in more BAME into their businesses? It's more of an observation, but again, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that, Charles, in terms of any of the research that we've been doing at CIPD.
Well, yesterday my colleague John Boyes gave a presentation which showed the scale of the economic contraction, and he was saying that even though some sectors were less affected, they were still affected to a certain extent, but just because of the massive shock that happened to the economy.
Yeah.
And so even though there were fewer jobs in certain sectors, not everybody could kind of get a job in a supermarket or delivering supermarket goods or goods for Amazon or whatever, just because the expansion there wasn't enough to accommodate the drop off in other areas.
Yeah.
Now, that hasn't been necessarily reflected in unemployment, because a lot of organizations were able to access the furlough system.
Yeah.
But I think the problem has been for those employees in atypical working who've fallen through the cracks. And I think this is where it's important for organizations to think about, about work as a whole, and what can we do to make our work good jobs. And that's looking at things like pay, benefits, security of employment, etc., etc. And I think the other challenge is what I was talking about earlier, is that I don't think organizations have necessarily been kind of collecting the data by ethnicity or analyzing the data by ethnicity. So in fact, they may not even have the data in the first place. So it's difficult for them to assess the impact of their decisions by race if they're not actually haven't got the data to begin with.
Great point. Thanks, Charles. So this is a question that I've heard quite a lot actually. With this, I guess we're the workforce is operating very differently. Whether it's hybrid working from home since the pandemic, and somebody on the call has mentioned that they work for a London-based company, but they've also got offices in Cardiff. So they're with the remote first kind of option for people. What does this actually mean for the kind of future of what would be typically called the London waiting salary? Particularly if you've got lots of people now working in different locations. So I'm going to come to you for that, Charles. I don't know whether we've got any kind of further insight around that, but it's definitely something that's coming through as a common question.
Yes, I mean, I think the first question, the first point of principle would be, again, if you have a fairness definition, this will help you think around how you will tackle, this issue, and then how you kind of communicate to employees as well as taking back their feedback. I suppose one issue is that many organizations, perhaps in the past, used to have a separate location allowance, but over time these have kind of been subsumed into pay rates. So it can be difficult now to kind of work out for organizations how much of the pay differential is due to the location allowance and how much is it due to other factors. And also it's going to be, I think it will be very difficult to start taking pay away from people, saying, well, it doesn't really matter where you work now, so we're just going to have one rate. I think because obviously there's going to be legal issues around that. And similarly, I think it's going to be difficult to kind of work out, well, what is a kind of a national rate which would kind of make us competitive across the UK, because the danger could be then you start finding out that certain pay level may actually be not competitive enough in certain regions. So you then have to start thinking about that, as well as all the support you're going to have to give people if they're if they're going to be working from home rather than in the office.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Charles, but I definitely think it's one that HR are going to have to navigate, because the likelihood is that many people will be moving and working in a different way due to the pandemic.
So that's why it's important, before that starts to kick off, having a fairness print saying, well, this is what we mean by, this is fairness, and this is how we're going to kind of deal with this move and requests to work from home.
Yeah, absolutely. So just on that, there is another question. I'm coming to you, Xiaowei, for this one, because you talked about some of the broader demographical challenges. Do you have insight around which places in the UK have been worst affected by the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So it seems actually that cities have been really badly hit. So in particular city centres, London has done, I think, the worst out of all the regions, specifically because it's so reliant on the service industry. Even within cities, we see the centre of London has done much worse, whereas people are spending more money in their local areas. So the sort of peripheries are doing better. And then, of course, it's the regions that were hugely dependent on tourism that have suffered a lot. So certain coastal areas, for example. We actually looked at whether areas that were classed as sort of left behind prior to the pandemic were also those that saw large impacts over the pandemic. And actually, we found that in general, there was not much correlation. The exception being coastal areas that were relatively deprived before the pandemic that have also seen massive loss to tourism income.
And do you have anything to add on that, Charles, or I'll move on to the next question?
I think the challenge is that the change typically, any change isn't typically evenly distributed. So you will have certain pockets of the country where there's suddenly an increase in demand for employees, but actually the people who don't have the jobs are based in another location of the UK. Now, it may be that the move towards flexible working may help some of those individuals, because it doesn't really matter where they live, because they can work from home or some other remote facility. The problem will be around those jobs where you have to be in an office environment or a factory environment or a retail environment. If you're based in one part of the country, it doesn't really matter if all these jobs are going in factories in a certain other part of the country, because you can't do it remotely. You actually will have to sell the house or stop renting and move. And potentially, if you've got kids and partners, it's going to be even more of problem to do that.
Sure. Thanks, Charles. I'm going to move on fairly quickly because we've got a number of questions. So somebody has shared that they've been reading about multiple gender consequences arising from COVID, and in particular the impact on women, but actually seeing some of the trends reverse in terms of, you know, women becoming more getting those senior management roles or joining boards. So I think I'll come to you, Xiaowei. It's just whether that's something that you're seeing, and some of the, you know, obviously what you presented is the opposite side to that. But are you seeing some shifts around some improvements here?
I'm not sure that there have been shifts specifically as a result of COVID. Of course, looking at the longer term, there have been general shifts, especially in terms of getting women on board, less in terms of reducing the gender pay gap overall. So the improvements we've seen have tended to be at the top end rather than across the wage distribution. I think though that it's possible that COVID could lead to beneficial effects on gender. I mean, I think I vary in how optimistic I am about this day to day, but there is an argument for, so we know that in general, because of school closures, both mothers and fathers have had to increase the amount of time they spend providing childcare, even though mothers have borne the brunt of it. But it's possible that that might change gender norms in the family, so that fathers are also more willing to take on childcare duties after the pandemic. It may be the case. There's some evidence from previous policy reforms in other countries that looking after kids is sort of habit forming, right? So once you increase your time spent with kids, you carry on doing that even when the policies no longer incentivize that. So I think that's definitely one thing. I think another is that if people start working from home more, that added flexibility might be particularly beneficial to mothers. And one thing that comes out of our research is that mothers, when they have kids, they're hugely constrained in the types of jobs they can take and where they can work. So when mothers have kids, they tend to start working closer to the home, I suppose, so that they can, you know, pick the kids from nursery and so on. They want to be closer by. And that, of course, restricts the opportunities that they have in the labour market. So, you know, one positive thing might be that if everyone starts to work from home, that also becomes less of a constraint, and mothers are able to access a wider range of careers.
Yeah. Thank you, Xiaowei, and that just echoes, I guess, what Charles was talking about, that kind of flexibility piece. And of course, CIPD is really championing this area right now, and in you know, encouraging employers to look at all forms of flexible working provision, which I do think will support you know, our kind of women at work. And just on the topic of childcare, there is a question, whether you can answer it or not, I'm not too sure, but I'll ask it because it's in the Q&A. So the question is, or I guess the observation is, that people often grumble about the childcare costs impacting their salaries, but childcare services then are berated for poor pay as well. So there's a kind of conflict, really. You know, are there any examples of managing this tension? It's quite a tricky one. I'm not sure whether either of you could answer that. If not, we'll try and find an answer to that question. But do any of you have any thoughts on that? I'll take that as a no, potentially.
Well, I mean, I could talk about. I mean, the thing is, it depends. I mean, we've got state education system, and perhaps we need to think about extending that to earlier years, rather or looking at, again, you know, there are tax breaks, but again, they're not particularly generous, depending on your circumstances. And as has been mentioned, you know, the rates of pay for these individuals working in those sectors aren't particularly high. So it's a case of, well, what do we need to do to make this profession more attractive, especially in terms of pay, but also more affordable? And it may be that, you know, we need employers and government action. Yeah. And I suppose I'd also highlight, it's not just though, you know, a lot of attention has been focused because of homeschooling on childcare, but also increasing elder care as well. Many employees are finding that they're having to kind of care for elderly relatives, parents, and some instances having to kind of cope both with childcare commitments as well as elder care commitments.
Yeah, it's a really good point actually for those carers that they have been impacted, particularly over the last year. Were you going to say something, Xiaowei, or? No?
Not in particular. No, I would agree with Charles that I think this is an obvious place for policy to step in and actually just increase childcare subsidies, or even go more radical and extend public provision of childcare like we do for schools. Yeah, I think on the employer side, it's quite interesting. I think it does come back to what Charles was talking about earlier in terms of having an overall framework of what is fair. Because on the one hand, you might think that, well, employers should step in and cover some of the childcare costs for their employees. But on the other hand, is it fair to prioritize employees with kids over employees without kids? Ultimately it's your own choice whether or not you should have kids or not, right? So yeah, I think that's quite a tricky question.
Yeah, no, but thank you both for sharing your reflections. And I think just on the topic of fairness and the definition of fairness, I mean, obviously, Charles, you referred to kind of the job quality indicators around working lives. I think there's a couple of questions going. What are the fair reward definitions? Is there somewhere that people can go where there's clearly a definition? And I get your point. Each organisation will be different because of the type of workforce they have. And you've shared some in your slides, but do we have anywhere where we've got that framework in place already, or is it something we're thinking of potentially offering? I'll come to you, Charles, first.
Well, we did, my colleague Wilson Wong did look at fairness and workplace fairness a number of years ago, and it rather depends from your perspective, and there are different ways of viewing it. So I think what's important is to kind of come up with a definition for a number of reasons and be able to then communicate. So, well, this is what we mean by fair. Yeah. Get the thoughts then from other stakeholders, refine it, and then come up with a definition, and at least everybody knows where they stand. And that's how you then deal with the tricky issues about, well, what do you do with employees who've got childcare commitments, those employees who don't have childcare commitments, those employees who had childcare commitments but are now may actually miss out on support because of timing, etc. Having a fairness definition would help with that. I mean, there are certain issues around pay. So there are you've got the voluntary living wage amount, which kind of looks at what the basic income you would need, a typical employee would need to have a reasonable lifestyle. I mean, that's one definition. You've got various other definitions from OECD about what low pay looks like. So those will be useful starting points for an organization when it comes to thinking about how much to pay people. But then, of course, you've got other issues around employee benefits. And it may be things, I suppose, one of the things that was highlighted by the pandemic was the paucity of sick pay support. So is there an option for an organization to look at the occupational sick pay that it gives its employees, as well as the other well-being benefits that it provides? And it may be that you start to see more of more focus from employers in the future, not only on kind of what happens if somebody falls ill, but what kind of steps can we take to ensure that they don't fall ill in the first place, and which could be costly both for the organization but the individual as well.
Thank you, Charles. I'm just conscious there's more questions coming in, so I'm trying to get through as many as possible. There's a question here, again, it's related to BAME recruitment. So, the fact that sectors may not have collated data on BAME shows that there's a risk. And I think you've both highlighted that in your different presentations. And I suppose there's the kind of reflection around it's about practices, but it's also about mindset. And I think, Charles, you touched on earlier around that kind of engagement with senior leaders and influencing. I wonder if you can just touch a bit more on that, because I think, you know, that you can have the policies and practices in place, and you can have the reward fairness framework in place, but, you know, what are some of the real challenges that our people professionals are going to have within organizations, you know, and how can we, you know, I guess, how can we encourage a different way of working when it comes to that engagement with business leaders, senior leaders?
Well, I think it's having a, you know, talking to business leaders about these are the risks if we're not fair, as well as these are the opportunities if we are. And I think also that, I think, as I touched on earlier, the importance of being able to kind of explore fairness within your organization, and the importance of having data. So there have been a number of high profile incidents where organizations have been investigated in terms of their fairness approach, and the problem has been that the information hasn't been there. The justification for why these people were being paid what they were had been lost in the midst of time. So I think it's important for organizations to kind of look at the records, the information systems that they've got, the records that they've got, to see whether they exist and the information is there. And also going forward, you know, to have a paper trail behind your decisions in terms of recruitment, in terms of promotion, in terms of bonus awards. So you do have that information to kind of fall back on when people are saying, well, why are you paying people for doing the same job differently? And you know, there may be a legitimate explanation, but if that explanation doesn't exist in your, you know, your filing system or your HR information system, you're going to have problems justifying that. Because at the end of the day, everybody probably has their own definition of fairness, and if organizations don't start having a discussion, then this void will be filled with multiple definitions. And you'll have difficulty explaining what your approach is if you're not able to say, well, this is what we think when it comes to fairness. Yeah, no, that's great. And Xiaowei, did you have anything to add to that? I've got a couple of more questions for.
Yeah, no, I broadly agree that I think the crucial thing is collecting data on these things, because if you don't know what your organization is doing, then you can't improve it, right? I think it's important to collect data at every step of the process, and especially with ethnic minorities, like really understand, you know, where can the process be improved? Like, is it about recruitment? Are you not getting in enough applicants? Is it about, you know, not recruiting enough people off the people who apply, or is it not promoting people along the way? I think it's really important to have this data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a comment and question, but you may have already answered it, around the kind of lack of visibility of things like promotional opportunities, because, and we touched on it earlier, Charles, that managers are unable to manage output rather than visibility. So when it comes to performance and reward, it's, you know, the role of the line manager and how they can actually help to influence some of this kind of, you know, bigger conversation around fairness. So I think we might have covered that off, although the main point of this question was around behaving fairly. You know, so again, it's about how do we behave fairly. So it comes into the kind of what we promote across the Institute around ethical practice and doing what's right. And I think you touched earlier on kind of the moral issues and the moral way we do things. So I just thought that was a good observation in terms of what you've been talking about. It's about the visibility, it's about the data evidence. There's a couple of more observations that I'm seeing coming through in the chat, and there was just one actually that I thought was interesting just to put to you both. So employees, somebody's mentioned that employees have made huge commuting savings in some instances. But, you know, whether or not that should be offset now against, you know, higher energy and food costs. So employees now are starting to ask about, well, the cost of being at home, and actually how does that, I guess, impact this, you know, discussion around fair reward practices. Charles, I'll just come to you on that one as a, you know, kind of final thought question, and you, Xiaowei.
I suppose it depends how organizations see the future of work going forward. I mean, at the moment, it's been quite unusual because where possible, employers have been required to ask their employees to stay at home and work from home. So unless they had a job where they had to be in a factory, or they had to be in an office, or they had to be in a hospital, etc., the expectation would be that they would work from home. Going forward, it's probably unlikely that many organizations will require employees in those types of environments to be at the office all of the time, but if they want to, that's their decision, and similarly at home. So there'll be this kind of a hybrid approach.
Yeah.
So the question then is, should organization, to what extent should organizations be paying people for working from home? Because at the moment, organizations are still going to have buildings. They're still going to have costs associated with that. So I'm not sure how easy it will be to kind of start paying for people's lighting, electricity, etc., when it's up to employees themselves how often they work, base themselves from home. But yes, I can see where at the moment how people have seen commuting costs going, but I keep getting emails from my energy provider saying they've got to increase my standing order or direct debit or whatever it is every month because I'm using more electricity and gas than they anticipated, but that's because I'm working from home more. Yeah.
Well, look, I'm really conscious it's, I was going to come to you, Xiaowei, but we will end very quickly. I want to thank you both very much for joining and sharing all your wisdom and insight, and to all of the people that have joined today. I hope you found it helpful. Just a quick reminder, the slides and the recording will be available on the CIPD website later on, and just a quick reminder of all the great things that I talked about earlier in terms of CIPD resources. So if you're not using them, please go on to the member resources area and find out more. But thank you all, and enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.